Hello, everyone. This is Savannah Bekowski, Project Assistant at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Water Audits and Water Loss Control, Gathering Your Data. This session is one of several webinars conducted by the Environmental Finance Center Network for the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. The EFCN provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all 50 states and 5 territories to help local water systems achieve and maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. For today's webinar, CEUs are available. More information on this will be provided at the end of the webinar. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that we have centers spread all across the country, from New York to Kansas to California. And here you can see the areas of expertise that the EFCN focuses on. Workshops, trainings, and direct technical assistance are provided on asset management, energy management planning, rates and finance, leadership through decision-making and communication, managing drought, water loss reduction, collaborating with neighboring communities, multi-funding, water conservation, management, and finance tools and techniques, climate change resiliency, and workforce development. The EFCN also has a small systems blog. You can learn more about water finance and management through this blog. You will have the opportunity to subscribe to this blog at the end of the webinar. In addition to workshops, direct technical assistance, and webinars, as part of the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project, we are also creating a table that lists the major funding sources for drinking water infrastructure projects in each state and territory. Here's how you can access those tables. On the homepage of the efcnetwork.org, you can go to Resources and then click on Funding Sources by State, and this will take you to a map of the country. If you click on the state you are interested in, you will find a PDF table of the relevant funding sources for drinking water infrastructure in that state. The table looks like the image on the left hand of the slide. For each funding program, it includes the name of the program, a short description, and contact information for someone who works in the program. Now, before I turn the presentation over to our presenter for today, I have 2 quick polling questions for you. The first one is, what kind of water and or sewer utility do you represent? Please select from one of the following: a for-profit, municipality, a non-for-profit, a special purpose district, or you're from a non-water or sewer utility. And about 5 seconds left to input your answers. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. As you can see, we have the majority of our attendees from a municipality, water or sewer utility, and a close second from a non-water utility. The next polling question is, what size water and or sewer system does your utility operate by number of people served? Please select from one of the following: very small, small, medium, large or very large, or a non-water or sewer utility. And about 5 seconds left to input your answers. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. As you can see, it's a pretty close tie between a non-water or sewer utility or from a medium-sized system. And at this point, I would like to introduce our presenter for today. For today, we have Heather Himmelberger, Director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. We also have a question and answer moderator for today's session, Dawn Nall. She is a Program Manager at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. Heather, welcome, and take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. And again, this is about water auditing and water loss control. And what we're focusing on today is gathering your data for that water audit. One little reminder before we get started. As Savannah mentioned, we have the website efcnetwork.org, and I just wanted to draw your attention to the assistance link. You can request free technical assistance by clicking on the link and filling out the form. And one of the areas for free assistance is in the water loss arena. So if after today you have questions or you would like assistance, please go ahead and fill out the assistance request form, and we're happy to try to help you. And one last reminder to remember to type in your questions at any time as we go along. We'll hold the questions to the end, but just in case you don't remember what your question was, go ahead and type it in at any point that you have it during the webinar. For part one, we're going to do a very brief review of water auditing and water loss, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, but this will be a very short overview. So does this look familiar? You have water produced, you subtract the water you sold, and you get some value that is often referred to as water loss. The question is, what does that water loss, when you just subtract water produced minus water sold, what does that value that many of us call water loss actually represent? So there's 6 answers on the screen, from water leaking from pipes to unaccounted for water, data practices, etc. If in your mind you think that value represents unaccounted for water, we want to hope to dispel that from now on. We're not using that terminology anymore. The water loss community has decided that what we really want to do is account for where all of our water is going and be able to deal with it. So don't think of that value as unaccounted for water, as that is now outdated and no longer used terminology. Then there are 4 answers that are partially correct, because all of those are components of the correct answer, which is actually non-revenue water. So what we want to try to think about is when we take our water produced minus our water sold, what we really have left is non-revenue water, or water that we're supplying into the system, but we're not receiving any money back for that. So non-revenue water includes all kinds of things, like the water that you use for the city, town, or municipal purposes for which you're not billing, illegal water use, so people who are stealing water from your system, water use by the water utility for flushing or other purposes, poor data handling practices, inaccurate meters, and then finally real water loss, which is actually leakage from pipes, overflow from storage tanks, or leakage from service lines. So non-revenue water includes a lot of things. Now, why do we care about understanding what our non-revenue water is and where it's going and what category it's in? Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are different tools, and in fact very different tools, that are applied to address different components of non-revenue water. So for example, if your problem is water theft, tools that address real water loss are not going to be effective. Or if your problem is inaccurate meter, again, tools that address something like real water loss is not the correct tool. So if you apply the incorrect tools, you may waste some money and you probably won't achieve the results you want. So it's really important for us to understand what non-revenue water is and what categories it falls in. There's one last reason, and it may even be more important than the other 2, is when you start trying to understand where your water is going and what non-revenue category it's in, you're going to learn a lot about your facility. You can't really do this excuse me, sitting in a corner and not talking to others at your utility, because it involves management, it involves finance, it involves technical aspects of your utility. So you really need to learn a lot more about your utility to effectively manage non-revenue water, and I think that's as important as anything else, is the ability to learn about your system. So what we see on screen now is a water balance, and this is balancing the water that you put into the system with the water that you take out of the system. So on the left-hand side is our water supplied, and on the right-hand side is the water that we deliver and use within our utility. If you look at the categories that are in green, those are the ones that generate revenue for the facility, and the ones in red and orange down at the bottom are the non-revenue categories. Now the water balance in this format may look a little scary, but AWWA, the American Water Works Association, has created a water audit software that makes it a lot easier to figure out the components of your water balance. And it's a lot easier to enter your data and information into their water audit software tool than it would be to actually complete the balance in the format I just showed you. What's really nice is this tool is free. on the American Water Works Association webpage. You can access it at awwa.org/waterlosscontrol, and you can download for free the latest version of the free water audit software. So moving on to part 2, what data will you need if you actually want to undergo or undertake a water audit process? What data do you need? It might feel like, how could you possibly have enough data? It might seem overwhelming, but if you break it into smaller pieces, it's not nearly as bad as it first appears. So the data that you need is going to fit in 5 categories: the water supplied, water delivered to customers, system characteristics, financial information, and then some other information that would be nice to have, but it doesn't directly get entered into the water audit software. So we're going to go into each of these 5 categories of data. Today's focus again is gathering the data, and I just wanted to make mention that we have a second or companion webinar on March 22nd where we'll look at getting the data out of getting your information out of the data you have and putting it into the spreadsheet. So today's webinar will talk about the types of data you need to collect, and then on March 22nd we'll talk about how do you pull that data out of the information you have and actually enter it into the spreadsheet. A couple of important considerations with your water audit data before we get any further. One thing to remember is most likely the data you need for your water audit was not generated for the purpose of water auditing. It might be great for the purpose it was intended, but it may not be quite as good for water auditing. So as an example, your billing system was set up to generate bills to your customers. It was probably not set up with water auditing in mind. So sometimes there's a little bit of a mismatch there between the purposes that you need it for and the purposes it was designed for. So just keep that in mind, that sometimes the data might not be in the format you want, and because of that there might be anomalies, issues, inaccuracies, or concerns with the data. You can address some of these concerns before you enter the data in the software, and others you'll have to address over time by maybe changing the way you collect data or the way that data is used. And finally, you may want to think about over time how you can change the way you collect data to make it more related to your water auditing needs. So maybe the way you collect data now will be different in the future when you get more into water auditing. But for now, just keep in mind that your data wasn't probably generated for the purpose of water auditing, and you may have some issues that you have to address, and going forward you can take care of that. Another thing to think about your data is how do you collect it? Do you collect it by hand, meaning it's written on a sheet of paper? Do you collect it electronically? Do you do some of both? And then where do you store your data? Is the data easy to find? Is the data hidden away somewhere? Is it on a computer, in a file cabinet? You know, where is that data? And you're going to have to think about this as you go through the process of collecting all of your data. And that's another thing you may want to change in the future. You may want to start storing more data electronically if you haven't done that already. Or you may want to collect data in one single place, as opposed to some data might be in the pump house, other data might be in an office, still other data might be you know, in the back of a truck somewhere. So as you get used to the types of data you need, you might change how you store and keep that data. So what we'll focus on now is data for water supplied. If we go back to the balance quickly, just to see what part of that water balance we're talking about, it's the yellow box on the left-hand side of the water balance that we're talking about. And if we look quickly at our AWWA water audit software, it's the first section of the data that we're going to enter, and it's in the category water supplied. And again, we'll focus more on entering data into the water audit software on the next webinar. So to get started with our water supply data, we want to think about what sources of water do we have in our system. And this is our own sources of water. We want to think about whether there's multiple types. Do we have both surface and groundwater? Do we have wells? Do we have springs? You know, how many of each do we have? We want to think about whether we purchase water in bulk from any other utility or water wholesaler, and then do we sell water in bulk to any other entity or outside customer. So we focus on our own sources for the first part. We want to ask ourselves, how many sources do we actually have? How many wells, how many water intakes, how many springs, how many of each of those do we have? And then a really important question is every one of those sources metered individually? Do we know each one of those sources and how much water they provide? And if we don't have them all metered, how do we know, or how can we estimate what we're actually producing from those wells? If we don't have any other metering, we might have to do pump run times or something like that, but we'll just have to recognize that that won't be as accurate as actually having a meter. Next question is, how often do we read each of these meters? So you could read them monthly, you could read them daily, you could read them quarterly, but the more often you read them, the better information you will have and the more quickly you can respond if there's any kinds of problems. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then the next question, do you measure the sources before and or after treatment? So when do you meter those sources? So here's an example. This is a water utility that we worked with. And this water utility has some sources. It goes through chlorination. They have a meter prior to the storage tank that's right here and a meter after. In this example, there is no customer between the treatment building and the storage tank. So the question is, which master meter should this system use to figure out how much water they're putting in the system? They should be using the one that's after the storage tank, because the storage tank, as it draws and fills, can change the volume. On an annual basis, when you're doing your water audit software, it's not going to make that big of a difference, but if you want to look at things on a month-to-month basis in the meantime, it could have a major impact. So think about where your meters are and what water is going in and out of those meters when you think about which ones are the best to use to look at water audits and what's happening in your system. Here's another example of another system we worked with. So in this particular example, it's a surface water system. They have a treatment facility. The water leaves the treatment facility, goes in the storage tank, is metered on the way into the tank, and then on the way out of the tank, some of it comes back to the facility for backwash, other water goes out to distribution, and then they have another meter going out to distribution. This particular system was using the meter prior to storage, but the problem is it wasn't counting the backwash water, and the backwash water was not being metered, so they introduced an error into their water audit. So what we really want to do is use the meter that's going out to distribution. So again, think about where your master meters are when you're deciding what data to use. Here's an example of a monthly master meter reading report where it shows each of their 4 wells and the readings. Well 1 hasn't been used, so it's showing up as 0. And then you can see some negative values only because this was taken in November before they had December's reading. But each month they're taking a reading and listing it. So the question would be, what are the downsides to reading your master meters monthly as opposed to daily? Well, if you're reading them monthly, you might miss something that happens in the middle of the month. So for example, if your meter would stop reading for some reason, you wouldn't know that. Or if it was a SCADA attached meter and maybe the SCADA reading went out for an electric storm for a couple of days, you wouldn't know that. If you just looked at the monthly meter reading, you might not know that. Especially if it was an intermittent thing that happened one day and not another day. If you just looked at the bulk value, you might miss something that happened on a given day. You also might miss it if there's been a huge spike in the amount of water coming out of your facility. Maybe there's a leak or some other problem in the system, and you wouldn't know that if you wait a whole month versus doing daily. So it's much better if you can do daily readings. That gives you a lot more information about your system. And it isn't that you'll put all the daily reads into your water audit software, but the daily reads will teach you about your system. So here's an example of a system that was doing daily reads on 3 different wells and a paper record format. You can do a paper record format like this, or you could enter it into a computer, or you could have a spreadsheet, all kinds of things. But in this case, with the daily readings, they would have a lot more information about what's going on in their system than a system that's only doing monthly. Here's an example where the data has been tallied for the whole year. So what was used January through December was tallied up with a total for the year. This is really helpful information to have when you're getting ready to enter the information into the software, but you want to make sure you do have the backup daily readings to go along with this. So if there's any month that doesn't look quite right, you can go back to the daily readings and see what's happening and try to troubleshoot the data. Here's a case where this particular utility had a negative water loss. They did the water balance and couldn't figure out why they had negative water loss, but you go back to their data and they had several months where they had 0 and just hadn't realized it because they weren't connecting up with the data source. So they would have to go back and really estimate for the time being, and then in the future years make sure that they were checking the daily reads, the monthly reads, and making sure that they filled in their data, because this creates a huge problem in your water auditing. Another question you can ask yourself is whether there's any places where master meters come together to add up to a third meter. So for example, you might have 2 wells and the 2 wells flow together and there's a meter on that other pipe. So meter reading 1 plus meter reading 2 equals meter reading 3. These kinds of opportunities give you a chance to do sort of a check on your meter readings. It's not as accurate as doing an actual test of your meters, but it can give you some information about whether or not your meter readings are accurate. So if meter reading 1 plus 2 doesn't even come close to meter reading 3, we know there's a problem somewhere in the meter readings, and that might give us a clue that we need to go out and do some investigation of our meters to find out which one or which ones are reading inaccurately. Let's move on to what if we purchase water in bulk from another water utility or a water wholesaler. If you don't purchase any water of this type, you can skip this part of the audit. If you do, you want to ask yourself how many locations is each location metered, and how often do you read those meters? You also want to know who reads them. Is it you, or is it the person who's supplying the water? If you never read them, if it's always the person supplying, you might want to think about getting somebody to read the meter from your own system as just a double check, because there are ways that meter readings can be wrong, and also the more often you read, the sooner you might find out there's a problem. So again, it would be a great idea to do daily reads of these meters, and if you can't do that, at least weekly reads of these meters, just to make sure that everything is okay. So here's an example of just a bulk sales meter for the year. Again, this is great data for the water audit, but you would want to have the backup information from daily reads, monthly reads, weekly reads, whatever kind of readings you have to double check, because otherwise you don't really know how accurate that information might be. And bulk sales or bulk purchases into your system are revenue that you have to pay out. So you have to pay for this water, so it's really important from a financial perspective to make sure this is correct. So on the other side, we talked about buying water into your facility. The other side is selling water out of your facility in bulk. So if you don't do this, you can skip this part of the audit. If you do, again, how many locations is each location metered, and how often is each one read, and who reads them, similar to purchasing. Same kinds of issues there. The more frequently you read it, the better off you will be. And again, an example of meter purchases, or meter sales, I'm sorry, from meter sales to other systems. So next we want to talk about your master meters and whether or not you've ever checked your master meters for accuracy. So the most important number in the water audit is really the water you supply, because that sets the whole rest of the water audit and will have a big impact on what your bottom line non-revenue water and real water loss numbers are. So you want to make sure that your meters are accurate. So you want to ask yourself, have I ever checked my master meters for accuracy? How often? And then I want to check 3 different things. I want to check the meter itself to see if that's reading accurately, the meter, how it's reading in its location, and the accuracy of the electronics associated with the meter. So if there's something sending a signal to SCADA or to a remote printout, is that reading correctly? So there's 3 different areas that you want to check the accuracy for. If you have done those kinds of tests, you want to have the data from the test. That includes what type of test, when you conducted it, and then what the results of the accuracy testing were. So the data from the master meter testing, an example of data is shown on the screen where there's 3 different wells, couple different days that they did the testing, how they did the testing, and then what the results were. We'll talk more at the next webinar on how you aggregate that into one result, because you can only put one accuracy number into the water audit software. So again, that's something we'll talk about more. But in the meantime, you want to gather any data that relates to master meter testing. The next part is we want to talk about data for the water we deliver to our customers. So where does this fit in the balance? This fits in the balance in the top right. And you'll notice a lot of it is, all of the revenue water fits in there. But so does a little bit of the non-revenue water. So this is authorized consumption that we don't bill for. So where do these show up in the water audit? They show up in the second component under authorized consumption. So when we get started with this data, we're talking about your customers, and is every customer metered? Do you read the meters on a routine basis? Do any customers have a meter but not receive a bill? And then is your water usage for non-customer purposes such as flushing, fire flow, cleaning, do you estimate that or track that water in any way? So for our billed meter consumption, this is the primary source of revenue in our water system. So we have customers, we bill them, we meter how much water they're using. So here's an example of meter reading data. So they have the last read, the last 2 reads, the gallons used for that month. They print out the report and the operator writes, or the meter reader writes in the new result, and then has a chance to make notes for any kinds of issues that might come up. Another example, another monthly meter reading sheet with the past read and then the new read, and then they have a chance again to write some notes. If you don't have those kinds of records, you might have to get them from your billing system. And so here's an example of a billing report that would show usage for the month. You could get a report like this for every single month and use that to help you gather up how much you have billed and metered to your customers. Here's an example of why you need to be keeping track of your meter readings and really look at it. This is a case where they took the worksheet out that had the past 2 months, filled in the new month, but they had the wrong number of digits. So this particular case yielded negative flow, and it was probably just a mistake in writing down the result. So it's always good to double check the results and see what's happening, because you might have an incorrect meter read. Moving on to billed unmetered consumption. So these are customers that have a bill, but you don't meter them. So they're just getting a flat rate. So maybe they're paying $30 a month or $20 a month or something like that. In these cases, it's very difficult to estimate how much your customers use, because it's just a best educated guess, because you don't know. So you're going to have to use some maybe some data from a neighboring utility that's in your area, because there are big differences between, say, the desert Southwest or the Northeast or the Midwest and how much water people use. Try to find decent metrics for what a typical household uses and use those kinds of averages to guess. Hopefully, in the future, you can move towards a metered system so that you can have better information about how much your customers use. Even if you want to keep the flat rate, it's still a good idea to have information about how much water people are consuming. For unbilled metered consumption, what we're talking about here is somebody has a meter and they do not get a bill for that. So the question is, do you read those meters? If they're not getting a bill, the tendency is to say, well, I don't need to read them. But for water auditing purposes, it's very important to know how much water is going out that way. So how often do you read those? Do you read them every month? Do you record those readings? Are they included in your billing system under a separate code, or do you have to save it somewhere else? So you might have to ask some questions of your billing department to see if they even track in any kind of way in their system how the meter or how these readings are done, or whether you're going to have to keep them elsewhere. So this is a very important component because it is a big non-revenue water component. Then we have unbilled, unmetered consumption. So to figure out what fits here, we ask the question, is it metered and is it billed? If the answer to both of those questions is no, then you ask, is it authorized? So is somebody allowed to use that water? If it is, it belongs in this unbilled, unmetered category. One thing to think about is you may have uses such as parks, city hall, school, sports field, etc., where you're providing them free water. If they're not currently metered, you want to meter them even if they're not billed. So for any kind of like permanent function where you're doing it the same place, the same way, you want to meter those. The things that we want to have in an unbilled, unmetered are mostly things like flushing, fire flow, street sweeping, things that are generally small, sporadic, and not consistent. This is difficult data to collect because it isn't metered. That's the whole point of this category, is it's not metered. Generally, the volumes are relatively small. If that's not true for your utility, you may have to do a little bit more work to collect this data. For example, noting which fire hydrants are flushed, how long they're flushed, that kind of thing. But there is a default value in the AWWA water audit software of 1.25%. So if you don't know anything else, it's a good idea to just stick with the default at the beginning, and then over time you can figure out ways to collect this data in a little bit better way, and you can change from the default to a different value. There's one other component that's underneath the authorized consumption, and that's the apparent losses, and there's 3 factors that go in there. The first is meter inaccuracies at the customer level. So you have to ask yourself, if you check any of your meters for accuracy, how often do you check them and which ones? Most utilities have way too many customer meters to check every one for accuracy. It would be very expensive and very difficult to do that. So typically you're just going to take a sampling of meters. You also may have a lot of meters that are different ages, different sizes, different manufacturers, and that gets into a lot of other issues. So you want to pick a few from each category. And AWWA does have a fair amount of information available for different ways to go about selecting meters for accuracy testing. So that's a good resource for you. If you do have customer meter accuracy testing, you want to collect that data and see what the results were. You're going to again have to find one number for accuracy of your customer meters to go into the water audit. So if you've checked 50 of them, for example, we have to do a flow weighted average to come up with the number to put in the audit software. And that's something, again, we'll talk about more next time. Another apparent loss is unauthorized use or theft. Somebody hooks up to a fire hydrant and takes your water away, and I am not implying by this picture that that's what's happening, but this is the kind of thing where somebody can steal water out of a hydrant, or they can illegally connect up to your mainline pipe. They might tamper with the meter, something like that. If you don't have a lot of this, or you haven't noticed a lot of unauthorized consumption, you can just use the default value that's included in the water audit software. There's kind of an assumption that every utility probably has at least a small amount of theft. If you have a large amount of theft, you may want to do a little more digging to try to have a different value. But if you're just sort of a routine, you don't come up with a lot of unauthorized consumption, then just go ahead and use the default of 0.25%, which is already included in the software. And the last apparent loss is data handling errors. So you can institute or you can cause errors in your data by how you handle it. So when you're transposing or transcribing information from handwritten into electronic, if you have SCADA system and the data is not transmitting correctly, there can be some errors that come into your data. Until you get more familiar with your data, it may be hard to find these. So there, again, there's a default value of 0.25%. At the beginning, that might be the best place to start. And then as you go over time, you might change that. So here's just an example, just some examples of data errors just to show you. These aren't necessarily things that you have to put in your audit, but I just wanted to show you how errors can occur. This is an example where a utility was trying to match meter reads with production meters, and they were offset. The cycle they read, the customer meters, was different than how they were reading the master meters, and they introduced quite a bit of error on a month-to-month basis, trying to take 5 days here and add it to there. So in the process, they introduced a lot of error in how they were doing their comparing their production meters to their customers. This is another example, a utility that was trying to do month-to-month looking at their utility and how the water loss went, but they had very different meter reading cycles. They did different cycles for billed and unbilled, so it created a lot of errors or potential for errors in how the data was handled because there were mismatched time frames. Moving on to system characteristics, where does this fit? It actually doesn't fit directly. It's an indirect inclusion in the water audit. It will show up in the system data portion of the water audit. So when we're looking at system characteristics, we're looking at whether or not you have a map to know where your pipes are located, if you know how many fire hydrants you have, where your customer meters are located, your system's pressure, and how many connections and customers you have. So starting with length of mains, the water audit software wants to know the total length of mains in the system. So with a GIS system, if you have such a thing, you could actually go in and figure out the value from using your GIS data. If you don't have that, you might have a regular map or a simple map that you can use to just measure the lengths, and that will at least give you some idea if you use the scale of map and the measurements. If you have no map at all, you might be able to just drive the streets where you think your pipes are and use the odometer reading to give you at least a good guess of how many miles of pipe. Here's an example of a Google Earth map that a utility used. Their utility is right here. So they used the Google Earth map to estimate how many miles of pipe they had. You can also use as-built drawings of mains if you have those. In addition to knowing the total length of pipe, there's also an interest in having the fire hydrant connection pipe added to that. So you can do this by estimating the total number of fire hydrants in the system and then estimating the number of feet between the main lines and the fire hydrant, as an average across the system. Then you just multiply the number of fire hydrants by the number of feet of pipe in the system divided by feet per mile to get the total miles of pipe, of fire hydrant pipe. And then to get the total length of mains, you just add the length of pipe to the length of fire hydrants. If it becomes too difficult to deal with the fire hydrants, a good starting point is just to focus on the total length of mains, and then in the future you can add in the fire hydrant. The number of service connections is the total number of connections to the system, both active and inactive. And it also includes the total number of fire hydrant connections, again, both active and inactive. So you want to count up every time you have a connection to your system to get the total. So again, in this case, the total number of fire hydrants plus the total number of connections is what you want to enter. And here's an example of a utility that just had a billing software where it added up the total number of customers. And this can be added to the fire hydrant number to give them the information they need. So there's different places you can look to try to figure out how many connections you have. The average length of service lines relates to where your meters, your customer meters are located, whether they're at the curb stop, property boundaries, or if they're in the house. If they're at the curb stop or property boundaries, the average length of service lines is considered 0. If they're not, you have to come up with an average service line length. And there's quite a bit of information within the software and related materials on AWWA's website to help you decide, because you can have a lot of variation between where the curb stop is and where the meter is located. You're going to have to come up with an average across the system to try to figure that out. If you have no meters at all, you have to consider the distance from the curb stop to the house. Similarly, just basically you're assuming that there would be a meter in the house. It's the same kind of calculation. The average system operating pressure is a number where we're looking for one average across the entire system. And generally systems have a wide variation. You can have different pressure zones. There can be differences based on where you're located near tanks or different elevations in the system. So if your engineer has done a hydraulic model for you, they may be able to provide you the average pressure. If not, you can take pressure readings across your system and estimate an average pressure. You can also use information like this where it's static pressure readings from the fire company where they've gone out and done some testing and can provide you the static readings, and you can use that to estimate a system operating pressure. For financial information, this is a similar case where it's not directly included, it's indirectly included. And it's at the bottom of the audit. It's the last part of the audit under cost data. So what you want to know here is the total cost of operating the facility, the retail cost of water, so the dollars per 1,000 gallons, and then the variable production cost of water, the dollars per million gallons to make it. So here's an example where a budget sheet, if you look at this and you can see the totals that you spent for the entire year, that can give you information for the total cost of operation. Your rate structures will help you figure out the dollars per 1,000 gallons. And again, we can only put one number in, so we have to do a little bit of math sometimes to flow weight average the dollars per 1,000 that we want to use. And then the last part, the variable production, we want to look at energy use and chemicals. So we want to gather data that looks at how much did we spend on, say, sodium hypochlorite or gaseous chlorine or chlorine dioxide or whatever we've used. We want to look for those costs. Maybe they're in like a billing system. Maybe they're in an accounting system. Maybe you just have a list of everything you spent, and in this case there's a lot of things they spent, and you just pick out the energy use. And you want the energy use for the utility, the treatment facility, and not the energy use for your building if you have one. Finally, other information that you might want to include in your data gathering efforts. None of this fits directly within the water audit, but it's very helpful as you try to deal with what to do about the non-revenue water. So it is not directly included in the water audit. So one piece of information is break data, both main lines and service lines. And you'd want to collect data on where, what kind of pipe, what day, that sort of thing. Any storage tank overflows or drainage you want to collect, and then storage tank levels. And storage tank levels are much more important if you're looking for shorter time frames. Like if you want to look at things over a month, you wouldn't use AWWA software, but you could track your water loss on a monthly basis. But then we need to know the tank levels. So here's an example of a system that has a couple of wells, has a few storage tanks. If they don't consider these storage tank levels, it can really throw off the audit when you're talking about it on a monthly basis. So it matters if the tanks were empty at the beginning of the month and full at the end and vice versa. So you have to start tracking those tank levels if you want to do shorter water loss evaluations. You also might want to look at the value of water that you're giving away. So if there are people, you know, City Hall, ball fields, schools, whatever, who receive free or discounted water, you might want to figure out what the value of that water is, just so you know how much revenue it accounts for, and people in your elected leadership can make decisions about whether that should go forward or not. The amount of water or value of water rebated to customers because of leakage in homes is another thing you might want to think about. So this is a case where systems may offer rebates to customers, and if they do, because of leakages, how is that water tracked? You want to make sure that they're not subtracting that out of the total volume, but rather just changing the billing amount. And there are some billing softwares that kind of require you to put it in, to change the volume as opposed to the bill. And in that case, you got to track, you have to track whatever data that is. So the next step would be, after you gather all your data, trying to get it ready to go in the water audit software, and that would be our next webinar. So join us on the 22nd. So in the meantime, what can you do at your own facility? You can start gathering your data in each of the 5 categories. So just look around your facility, talk to operators, talk to the finance people, billing clerks, whoever you have. And the smaller your utility, the fewer people you have to talk to. The larger your utility, probably the more people you have to talk to. Gather the data that you have and get it together sort of in front of you to see what is there. At the beginning, your data quality may not be very high, and there may be a lot of missing pieces. Don't worry about that. Just start wherever you are. Go ahead and make any assumptions you need to. And again, we'll talk next time about where to include that in your water audit software, the documenting your assumptions. And then this is one of my favorite quotes. I wish I would have made it up, but I didn't. But don't let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can do. You may not have every bit of data you would like, but that's okay. Go ahead and do what you can with the data that you have, and just work from there to improve it. It may take you 3, 4, 5 years to get your data the way you want it. That's okay. You're getting better each time. You're learning more about your utility, and you will make progress. I have our contact information for myself and Dawn that I wanted to put up before we get to the questions, just to let you know that if you have any questions, in addition to the form that you can fill out, you can also contact Dawn or I with any questions on water auditing. So with that, I will see if we have any questions. So Dawn, if you're there, do we have any questions that have come in?
So Heather, unfortunately, the storm did arrive in Dawn's location.
Oh, okay.
So she lost power, but I have been documenting the questions, and we have 4 ready to go. So
okay, let's get going.
The first one is, an attendee states, our water system struggles with high water loss due to age and large rural geographic area. Should we be metering and charging ourselves for flushing water?
Generally speaking, you don't charge yourself for flushing the water, but if you have a lot of flushing that's going on, it's not a bad idea to collect some information, at least documenting when you flush the hydrant and for how long you flush the hydrant. If you think it's really bad, you can also look at possibly metering the flow as you're flushing. But generally speaking, we don't see people who bill themselves for the flushing water. But a starting place, again, would be just documenting, you know, when do you flow the hydrants? Is it every day, every week, every month, every quarter? You know, how many are you flowing, how long? And then you can make a decent guess at the flow rate out of the hydrant if you don't have a meter. And then use that to estimate how much water that is. And if it seems like a lot of water, you might want to think about, are there any operational changes that you can make to see if that's the correct amount of flushing, or are there ways to make that flushing program a little more optimized. But I would say the starting point is just to collect some information for a while, probably a whole year, and see what you think the nature of that flushing water is, like how much that equates to, and see if it is above or below the default value. So the default value for that is 1.25% of the water supplied. So you can get a feel for if you seem way above that number, then you're probably, compared to other utilities, doing a lot more flushing. That may be required to keep your water quality where it is, but it's something you could look at more in depth to see if there are any changes you could make.
Thank you. And the next question is, how do you test the meter itself? Do you send it off to a factory for testing? And also, when testing in situ, do you use a range of flow rates, such as 1 pump, 2 pumps running, etc.?
The first question about whether you send them off or whether you do it in-house kind of depends on the meter and how long you could be without it. Usually the smaller meters you might have to take out of service for a period of time, replace with a different meter, test it, and if it's okay, put it back. The larger meters we often just test without taking them out. So it can be done either way, and there are companies who specialize in meter testing, and there are companies all over the country who do that. So you could be highly likely that you could find one in your area that could work with you to find the best way to test it. And it's not a bad idea to have it tested at various flow ranges, because some meters, sometimes they don't put in the right meter for the application, and maybe at low flows it's a lot less accurate than higher flows, and so they design a meter that, if all 3 pumps are running, it works really well, but if you only have 1 pump running, it's not as accurate. So I think that's probably a good idea to take a different flow ranges to test that, especially that master meter. But generally speaking, it's not tremendously expensive to get them tested, so maybe look in your area or talk to neighboring systems about what companies they've used, check out a few, and work with them to get your meters tested.
Thank you. And then, as a nice follow-up, how often is it recommended to test master meters?
The recommendation in the AWWA software is annually. So that's probably a good time frame to do them every year. You certainly could do them more often if you wanted to, but annual is probably a good recommendation for that.
All right, so an attendee also states that if their system reads their meters monthly during the last 4 consecutive weekdays of the month, what day should we use for our master meter reading?
It depends if you're talking about an annual cycle, which the AWWA software looks at an entire year. So what you put into that software is a whole year's worth of data. So you would start with either a fiscal year or calendar year. So let's assume calendar year. And in that case, you would use January 1 to December 31st for your master meter reading. And then for your customer meter readings, because they'd be off just a little bit, if you take an entire year, they're not off by that much, because you will have had, the couple of days will appear in, say, January's readings, those couple of days from December, and then you'll lose a couple days at the end of December. But it kind of works its way out if you're talking about a whole year. So you try to match them as close as you possibly can. But again, if it's a whole year, the discrepancy, is only usually off a little bit. If you're talking about a monthly situation where you're trying to do some internal things to check on a monthly basis, kind of what's happening, then you got to be really careful. And you would want your master meter readings to be as closely matched to your customer readings as possible. It's probably not possible to get it exactly accurate. If you're reading over the 4 days, maybe you pick, halfway between and pick, say, the reading from the second day, the end of the second day. But you could almost look at the data on those 4 days, your production data, and see if one of those choices seemed to make the most sense. You can also just recognize that there will be a little bit of error introduced if you're looking at the customer data on a slightly different time frame than the master meter data, because the best you can do is you're still going to be off by a couple of days. So just be as close as you possibly can, and maybe pick one that's like halfway in between. Maybe the end of the second day would be my suggestion. But again, if you do the annual software, a lot of that error gets worked out.
Wonderful. And the next question is that an attendee asked, during your presentation you stated to track the water rebated. Their system offers leak insurance, and they track the amount we don't get in revenue. The attendee was told that they could not use that in their water audit. Is that correct?
What I'm talking about there is you got to be careful when the billing software gets adjusted because of the rebates. So there are systems for whom, say, 100,000 gallons goes through a leak in somebody's house. So it passed through the meter, and then they go to the water utility, and the water utility says, we will rebate you back the money. If all they do is rebate the money and the volume stays in that billing program, you're okay. Some billing programs can't do it that way. So then what the billing clerk will do is adjust the volume. So it will change the 100,000 to, say, 6,000. So now 94,000 is kind of gone from that billing software, but you need to know it for the water auditing because 94,000 went through the customer meter. So what I was talking about is you have to find a way to track it if your billing software is not accounting for the rebates properly. So generally speaking, as long as it remains in the billing software, the volumes do, you're okay. But when you have a system where the clerk is adjusting the volumes to take care of it so that you get a lower bill, then you've got a problem in your water audit because it shows up as real water loss instead of showing up as customer going through the customer meter. So that's something to think about. And then the other thing you can think about is whether you want to track the cost of those rebates. So how much water has been passed through somebody's meter, but you're rebating the cost. So over the course of a year, some utilities track that and some do not. So they don't really know how much money that adds up to. So, if 10 customers have a leak, it's very different than if 1,000 customers have a leak. And you may have to adjust your rebate practices if you get too many people that have the issue. It might cost you too much money. So those are the two things. But generally, as long as it stays in the billing software, you're okay. If it's adjusted out of the billing software, you've got to have another way to track it so you can put it back in as customer usage.
Thank you, Heather. So there were a few other questions, but at this time we are out of time for further questions. So we will be following up with the unanswered questions via email offline. Quickly, before we do wrap up, I have two more quick polling questions. The first one is if you would like to subscribe to the Environmental Finance Center blog. Just about 5 more seconds to quickly input your answers. If you don't have a chance to submit your polling answer today, you can sign up for the blog on the EFCnetwork.org website. I'm closing the poll now. And the final polling question is if you would be interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance if you are a small water system of 10,000 or fewer people served. And again, if you don't have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can sign up for that on the EFCnetwork.org website. And getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Finally, there is a survey.
Savannah, I don't know. Did you change the screen to you? Because I didn't see the poll. I don't know if it's just...
Oh, it's still on your screen, but I think the poll went through because I received some answers.
Okay, great.
And so lastly, in the chat box, there is a survey link and the CEU Assistance email. As attendees of this webinar, you will receive a certificate of attendance for viewing the webinar today. This webinar has not been submitted to the licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. AWWA recommends that you check with your licensing agency to learn about its criteria, rules, and what you need to do in order to receive your CEU. It is your responsibility to verify this information with your licensing agency, and if you need assistance, the education services at awwa.org will be able to help you with that. Heather, thank you so much for a thorough presentation on gathering your data for a water audit. I want to thank all the attendees for joining us today, and I'll throw it back to you for any last comments.
Just one last thing, just one last plug to today we talked about gathering your data. If you want to, in the next couple of weeks, start gathering that information. On the 22nd of March, we'll have another webinar, and we'll talk about getting it from the raw data format into your water audit software. So join us, please, if you can, on the 22nd, and we'll talk some more about how to go from your data that you've collected into the water audit spreadsheet and develop your water audit. And one last thing I'll mention is that we've worked with many small utilities and some larger ones as well. And there really hasn't been anybody that we haven't been able to work through the data process with and finalize an audit. Sometimes it takes a little longer than others as you look for one piece of data or another, but I'm sure that if you just take a little bit of time, you'll find enough data to be able to complete the water audit and get started with monitoring your water losses and your non-revenue water.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.